Thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. This is our penultimate session before the Christmas break. It is with great pleasure that I would like to introduce Dr. Laura Marongiu from the University of Cologne. She will talk about a topic of extreme interest today for the project, Psychogony. Did world soul come into being in time? So thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Dr. Marongiu, and I leave you the stage.
So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here and to have the opportunity to discuss with you about this topic. So perhaps before I start, I'll just share my handout. So I have no slide, but I have an handout with the passages. So I hope you received it. So I hope it works. And I can also share my screen so that it's maybe easier to read the passages together. So can you see that? Okay, perfect. So I start. As you can see from my title and also from my abstract, the main question I'd like to deal with today is whether the world soul came into being, and if yes, whether this generation can be said to take place in time. So this question perhaps today might seem a little bit odd, but in antiquity was, as is well known, very highly discussed. And one of the reasons of this relevance is that the coming to be of the world soul is closely interwoven with the question of the creation of world and, of course, also of time. The question of the generation in time is usually raised with respect to the cosmos, and I shall deal with the same question, but by focusing especially on the world soul. To speak of a world soul birth is problematic for many reasons. One of them is the fact that the soul is described sometimes, for example, in the Phaedrus, as ungenerated and imperishable, while in the Timaeus, we are told that it came to be and that its birth took place before the cosmos, and thus also before time. This raises the question whether the pre-cosmic chaos had already a soul before the intervention of the Demiurge, and this problem has been labeled by Baltes as an unsolvable difficulty, and of course we are not going to resolve this riddle today, but yeah, let's try at least to shed some light on it, both by relying on some Platonic passages and also by focusing on the later reception. So in what follows, I shall, in the first part, frame the problem of the generation of the soul, both in the context of the Timaeus and within the debate concerning the generation of cosmos in time. And in the handout, this is the text number 1 and the table. Secondly, so in the second part, I should closely examine, so this is T2 Timaeus 34-35, along with some other Platonic parallels, for example, the laws, where the soul is said to be older than the body, so than the cosmos. And in this framework, I shall also address, I shall also take into account, so this is T6, the Phaedrus, where the soul is explicitly said to be ungenerated, so agenetos. Finally, in order to cast light on this inconsistency, that is the soul as generated and the soul as ungenerated, I shall deal in the third section with 2 conflicting views put forward by Plutarch. This is text 8, 9, and 10. And by Proclus, so text from 11 to 13. So let's start. I would like to start not with the Timaeus, but with a passage contained in the Republic. We are in Republic 8, in the context of the Muses' speech on the natural number or geometric number. And at the very beginning of their speech, the Muses introduced their explanation of the decline of the best political order, or Callipolis, by presenting a general principle. And this is the principle we find in T1. I quote, it is hard for a city composed in this way to change, but everything that comes into being, so genomeno, must decay. Not even a constitution such as this will last forever. It too must face dissolution. So in a few words, since Callipolis came into being, it will sooner or after perish, just like everything that came into being. So let's leave now Callipolis aside, but against the background of this general principle, we might raise the question, so what about cosmos, time, and the soul? So in the Timaeus, so they somehow, let's say, come into being, but are said to be imperishable. So as you can see in the table, so as far as the cosmos is concerned, we read that has come to be. So this is the famous Gegonen in Timaeus 28:7. And then even if it has a beginning, it has no end. As you can read on the right side, having come together into a unity with itself, the cosmos could not be undone by anyone but the one who had bound it together. Also, this is what we read here too. So the cosmos had been, or that the heaven, or which is the cosmos, has been, so gegonos, is and shall be for all time, ton apantakronon, forevermore. The same holds true also with respect to time, as we can read in this quote in 38:6-7, so here. So time then came to be, here we have again Gegonen, together with the universe, so that just as they were begotten together, they might also be undone together, should there ever be an undoing of them. And yeah, in this respect, it's also interesting what we read in 41 AB, which is not in the handout. And here, yeah, the Demiurge speaks to the gods, and here we learn that everything which came to be because the Demiurge so wished to will not perish. In other words, so we are dealing with generated entities which are not absolutely imperishable, but which will not perish anyway in virtue of the Demiurge's will. So let's now turn to the world soul. So with respect to the world soul, that too came to be, as we can read in 36 E5. So the visible body of the universe on the one hand and the invisible soul on the other hand came to be, Gegonen. However, it has no end. So as you can read on the right side, this is 36 E45. So the soul initiated a divine beginning of unchasing intelligent life for all time. So prostos symbanda chronon. And such a view is of course also confirmed by a number of passages in other dialogues which address the immortality of the soul. So at this point we may ask, so how can the cosmos, time, and the world soul be both generated and imperishable? And what does it mean precisely that they came into being? So as far as the cosmos birth is concerned, yeah, this question gave rise to the famous debate, so the famous controversy between the holder of the literal interpretation, so creation took place in time, and the allegorical one, so creation as a metaphor introduced for the sake of explanation, of clarity. I won't enter into the details of this debate since it's very well known, but of course it is important to keep it as a background for our following reflections on the soul. So what is interesting is how the puzzle of the cosmos birth involves, on the one hand, the creation of time, since they came to be together, but also, on the other hand, the question of the generation of the soul, since the Timaeus stresses that the soul's birth took place before the cosmos was born. And this is the main point of the text, which you find in, this is text number 2. Perhaps before reading it, some introductory words on the broader context in which the world soul is introduced. So before introducing the world soul here in 34b10, Timaeus has already described the composition of the cosmos body by the Demiurge. And then here begins the description of the composition of the world soul. And only after having completed this description, Timaeus comes to speak of the generation of time. So in short, according to the order of exposition or of narration of the dialogue, we have first the generation of the sensible cosmos, second, the one of the world soul, and third, the generation of time. However, it is worth noting that this order of expositions of cosmos, soul, and time does not reflect the actual and temporal sequence of creation. A first piece of evidence of this lack of correspondence is that time and the sensible cosmos came to be together, so simultaneously, although the discussion on time is postponed. A second piece of evidence is that the description of the soul's generation follows the one of the world, of the sensible cosmos, even if the world soul came into being before. And as I was already anticipating, this is the core message of the text number 2. We can read it now together. I quote, so as for the world soul, even though we are now embarking on an account of it after we've already given an account of its body, it isn't the case that the god devised, so emechanesato, devised it to be younger than the body. For the god would not have united them and then allowed the elder, presbyteron, to be ruled by the younger. We have a tendency to be casual and random in our speech, reflecting, no doubt, the whole realm of the casual and random of which we are part. The god, however, gave priority and seniority to the soul. So the soul is described as proteran, so prior, and presbyteran, so older, both in its coming to be, so genese, and in the degree of its excellence, so arete, to be the body's mistress and to rule over it as a subject. And here follows the important description of the ingredients that the Demiurge used in order to compose the soul. This passage in T2 is interesting in many respects. For example, interesting is this reference to the limitations of language. So we read the language that we use is random, is casual, and is akin to the sensible world we live in, we belong to. From the linguistic point of view, it is also interesting the use of the language of the poiesis. So Timaeus uses the word emechanesato, which in the translation, so is here. In the translation is devised, which is correct, but just to note that in the Greek, the term also means fabricate, make, so that the world soul is built, is made. And apart from these, the several aspects we may stress and underline in this passage, I'd like to focus on the core message. And as I was already saying, so the core message is the priority of the soul, which is described in terms of seniority. In other words, the soul is older, so presbyteron, and it could not be otherwise, since the god would not allow the older to be ruled by the younger, so the soul to be ruled by the body. And for this reason, the soul is conceived of as the mistress of the body and rules. And what is striking is that the soul is not only prior in terms of virtue, so in the degree of its excellence, on the axiological level, we might say, but also in terms of generation, so genese. And by saying that the world's soul is older, Timaeus seems to suggest that the soul comes to be before also in temporal terms. We'll turn back to this question also later. So the priority or seniority of the soul is a leitmotif also in a number of further Platonic passages. And an example is Law 10. So these two passages, text 3 and text 4 in your handout. we can read text 3, a quote. "It's the soul, my good friend, that nearly everybody seems to have misunderstood, not realizing its nature and power. Quite apart from other points about it, people are particularly ignorant about its birth." And we find again Genesis. It is one of the first creations. And then born, we have here again genomene, long before all other physical things. And anything closely related to soul would necessarily have been created, so again, gegonota, before material things, since soul itself is older, so presbyteras, than matter. And this is also confirmed a few lines later in the text number 4, where the soul, so here the soul is defined as motion capable of moving itself, and therefore proves to be the source of motion of everything else. And on this base, it is said that, so I won't quote the whole passage in full, but I wanted to underline here a passage. So it has been proved up to the hilt that the soul, being the source of motion, so archeia kineseos, is the most ancient thing there is. So to sum up, also in the laws, the soul is said to be generated. Then the Athenian speaks of its birth, regards it as one of the first creations anterior to the body and to matter. And moreover, it is to note that the soul, since it is the source of movement, proves to be the most ancient thing there is. And yeah, I anticipate already that this claim will be also important in light of the next passage we shall focus on, which is the passage number 6, the Phaedrus passage. Before that, I just note in passing that an analogous view on the anteriority in terms of seniority of the soul can be found also in the Epinomis, which is not probably not an authentic Platonic dialogue, but it's interesting as well because it's very close to the to Plato's Academy. I'm not going to read the passage, but just to point out that there are striking similarities with T2, with the passage of Plato Timaeus. So here too, the soul is older than the body. So to sum up, the passages we've examined so far seems to make the following claims. So first, the soul came to be, and secondly, more precisely, it came to be before the body, which means that it's prior, not only in terms of dignity, so by virtue, because it's more godlike, or because it rules, but also in terms of genesis. And the crucial issue in this respect is, so does the priority in terms of genesis imply generation in time? And so in answering this question, modern scholars divide in 2 groups. Yeah, there are also many in between, but these are the 2 opposite poles, so to say. So some of them answer yes. For instance, Robinson argues, whatever Plato may intend, he's certainly talking in terms of the temporal sense of genesis. Or Vlastos, who says, yeah, there can be no doubt that the meaning is that the soul was generated prior to the body. But we find also several interpreters on the opposite pole, on the opposite side, who argue that temporal priority does not coincide with ontological priority, so they are not synonyms. And yeah, to classics in this framework, so we may quote Cornfoot, who says, so the world's elder and prior here obviously do not mean that the world soul existed before its body. Or in similar terms, Tianis, who says, obviously prior and elder does not mean earlier. So, as we shall see, such views are not too dissimilar, too far away from the ones which were defended by ancient commentators, and indeed seems to base on them, but we'll get to this point later. So now let's move a step further, and so the Phaedrus passage, the 6. So we have already noted that psychogony can be at odds somehow with the general principle stated in Republic 8, according to which everything which comes to be also will perish. And now we'll see that psychogony is also difficult to reconcile with the account on the soul provided in the Phaedrus, where the soul is explicitly said to be not subject to a generation, so ageneton. This is text number 6, I quote. So the starting point of the passage is every soul is immortal, and then the passage consists in providing a demonstration of it. So psyche pasa athanatos, every soul is immortal. That is because whatever is always in motion is immortal. In fact, this self-mover is also the source, so arche, and spring of motion in everything else that moves. And the source has no beginning. Yeah, so this is important. So arche, the source has no beginning, is ageneton. That is because anything that has a beginning comes from some source, but there is no source for these, since a source that got its start from something else could not longer be the source. And since it cannot have a beginning, so since it is ageneton again, then necessarily it cannot be destroyed. And if this is so, that whatever move itself is essentially a soul, then it follows necessarily that souls should have neither birth nor death. So ageneton tekai athanaton. So as we can see, this passage puts forward, first of all, the claim, so every soul is immortal. And then this is the starting point, and then provides a demonstration of it. And the demonstration of the soul's immortality here depends on the soul's definition. And so we can perhaps sum up briefly the steps of the argument. So the soul is both a self-mover, and for this reason it's also the source of the movement, of the motion of everything else. And since it is a source, so since it is an arche, it has no beginning, so it is ageneton. Otherwise, it would not be a source anymore. And since it cannot have a beginning, then necessarily it cannot be destroyed. And then it follows that the soul, in virtue of its nature, in virtue of its definition, is both ungenerated and unperishing. So it has neither beginning nor end, or in other words, neither birth nor death, as we have read. So now, if we compare the Phaedrus with the Timaeus, we are confronted with an inconsistency, with a contradiction. While in the Phaedrus, the soul is so ungenerated, and the Timaeus came to be. And so how can we deal with this inconsistency? So in modern times, there have been different ways to deal with this contradiction. So a first way is to hold that the soul's generation in the Timaeus is merely a myth or a fiction. A second way is to say that the two dialogues so imply or presuppose two different meanings of generation, such as temporal generation in the one and ontological generation in the other. According to a third view, the inconsistency can be solved by laying emphasis on the specific context in which the two contradictory claims are made. And I'll come back to this approach in my conclusion. But there are also some interpreters who think that no reconciliation is possible, and also some other who hold that we have this contradiction because Plato developed his thoughts. So this is the so-called developmentalist approach. And thus, we can find in different dialogues views which are not consistent with each other. So in short, Plato changed his mind. And this seems to be Plastus' view, who says, so I quoted him, so this is the passage number 7. So he says, could anyone claim in all seriousness that Plato thought his reader would be so certain of the immutability of his philosophical views that if they should happen to find him saying P in one work, in this case, yeah, P in one work is the soul is generated in the Timaeus, the mere fact that he said non P years earlier in another work would give them to understand that it did not really mean P when he said P in the later work. No one, to my knowledge, has made such a claim, and I cannot imagine that anyone would. End of the quotation. So, I mean, if we look back and we take into account also the ancient commentators, we do find someone who would claim something like that, and also in all seriousness. So I propose now that we turn to some ancient commentators and see how they read our passage and see how they tried to make sense of this inconsistency and how they tried to solve this contradiction. So to take into account their views, it's interesting for many reasons. First of all, because they could not tolerate either that Plato contradicted himself or that he changed his mind, as assumed, for example, by scholars who endorse a developmentalist approach to Plato. Moreover, their views are valuable because Platonists are in general genuinely interested in the question of the beginning of the soul, a question which is in their eyes as a particular cosmological depth, a cosmological relevance. And so why Plutarch and Proclus? I chose to focus especially on them. So first, because they dwelled on our passage in T2 at length, and also because they present to somehow conflicting views, and for this reason, it is interesting to compare them. So let's start with Plutarch. As far as Plutarch is concerned, as is well known, he devoted thorough attention to the Timaeus more generally, and also to the question of the generation of the soul in particular. He devoted an entire treatise to this issue, which is on the generation of soul in the Timaeus, the Anima Procreatione. And this issue is also addressed in his Platonic questions, and perhaps also in a lost treatise. So compared to other Platonists, his approach toward the Timaeus is somewhat unusual, as Plutarch himself points out. So he labels his own account as unusual and paradoxical, and says that that he's writing this treatise because his account is in need of vindication because of its opposition to the most of the Platonists. So as a matter of fact, he represents one of the few exceptions in defending a literal interpretation of the Timaeus, that is in maintaining that both the cosmos and the soul came to be in time. He criticizes the other Platonists, who are the majority, who thought that Plato in the Timaeus spoke of generation only for the sake of examination, for the sake of clarity. And those Platonists, so says Plutarch, manipulate and force and twist everything in Plato's text and seem to be utterly mistaken about Plato's opinion. Conversely, he decides to undertake a literal reading of the dialogue, and his aim is to try to say something which agrees with Plato. So his main thesis, as I said, is that the world soul generation takes place in time as a punctual event. And of course, since he claims that, he has to confront himself with the Phaedrus. And it goes without saying that Plutarch rules out the possibility that Plato contradicts himself, as we read in T8. So I quote from T8. So for one would not attribute even to a drunken sophist, and it is nonsense then to attribute to Plato in regard to the doctrines about which he had been most seriously concerned, such confusion and capriciousness, so as to declare of the same entity, in this case is the soul, both that it's unsubject to generation and that it did come to be. In the Phaedrus, that the soul is unsubject to generation, and in the Timaeus, that it came to be. So he also gives us some information and some clues on the exegetical approach he's going to adopt in order to harmonize the two different views, the two different dialogues. As we can see in T9, he says, what way of adjusting this statement is there then, other than what Plato provides himself for those who will accept it? And moreover, he also says, I shall apply the interpretation and the demonstration to the text, at the same time bringing them into accord with one another. So in short, so Plutarch tries to find inside Plato a way to remove the contradiction. So in other words, he reads Plato by means of Plato, and his aim is to harmonize his different texts, or in other words, in his words, yeah, to bring them into accord with one another. And in order to reach this goal, in the present case, his strategy is to draw a distinction between two different souls, or more precisely, two different stages within the life of the soul. And the first one is a precosmic stage. Here we have a precosmic ungenerated soul, which is called the soul itself, which is non-rational and which is also a source of motion, but of disorderly motions. And on the other hand, in the second stage, we have a world soul, which is generated, whereby generation means that the soul itself, at some point in time, became rational and well-ordered in virtue of the Demiurge's intervention. And this distinction is put forward in the text number 10. So I quote from text 10. For unsubject to generation, so Agheneton, is said of the soul that before the generation of the universe keeps all things in disorderly and jangling motion, but come to be and so subject to generation, is said, on the other hand, of soul that God installed as chief of some of things. And a few lines later also, whereas the one soul neither was brought into being by God, nor is the soul of the universe, that keeps on line, the other one was regulated by God himself, which with the appropriate numbers and ratios, and then being generated, was installed by him as chief of the universe that had come to be. So, and it is by means of this distinction that Plutarch saw the apparent contradiction between the Timaeus on the one hand and the Phaedrus on the other. So the soul in itself of the precosmic stage corresponds to the ungenerated soul of the Phaedrus. When this soul in itself becomes harmonious and well-ordered, this becomes the world soul. And at this point of time, we say that the world soul was generated. And this is precisely the generated world soul of the Timaeus, which came to be and which is older than the cosmos. So let's now turn to Proclus, the last three texts. So Proclus, as we should see, somehow adopts similar exegetical principles, but draws a completely different conclusion on the generation of the soul. The most extensive treatment of the creation of the world and of the soul is to be found in his extensive commentary on the Timaeus, for what regard, in respect to psychogony and the generation of the soul, the most interesting is probably the third volume, the third book of the commentary. And it is to note that Proclus, of course, comes much later than Plutarch and much later than many other commentators who dealt with the problem of the generation in the Timaeus. And for this reason, his commentary is also a very important source from the historical and doxographical point of view, because it presupposes a very wide knowledge of this debate. So let's see what is his view. So as I already anticipated, according to Proclus, the whole story of creation addressed in the Timaeus should be not understood in its literal meaning, in its literal surface. In the Timaeus, it's true, Plato speaks of generation, but that should not be understood in the sense of everyday language use. His strategy to spell this out is to draw a distinction between different meanings of generation, whereby to have a temporal starting point is only one of the possible meanings that the term generated, generation may assume. And in the Timaeus for Proclus, it is evident that we are not dealing with the temporal meaning of the term. Following this line of thought, he claims in text 11, I quote, Plato makes it clear, even to those whose powers of comprehension are small, that he is not fuddling about the question of temporal beginning, but rather about whether, in the light of the many kinds of generation, the universe has some beginning of generation. And it is in light of this assumption that it reads the birth of the soul and it's being younger than the body in the Timaeus. As we can read also in the following text, so text 12, so he says the words senior and younger, so he's quoting our text number 2, should not be taken in a temporal sense, so kataphronon, but rather with reference to the order of their essence, so the taxates ousias. So what is closer to the Demiurge is senior, but what is farther away is younger. As a result, the soul is older, however, not in temporal terms, but rather in ontological terms, so according to the order of the essence. And this argument is restated again also a few lines later, which is the text number 13 in your handout, where it says, after all, the birth of the soul, so Genesis des Psyche, is not a temporal one, kataphronon, but rather it proceeds in respect of its essence from intelligible causes. So it is interesting that in this passage, so in bracket, Proclus mentions the Phaedrus. So he says, for the soul was shown to be ungenerated, ageneton, and indestructible in the Phaedrus. This is a very brief but also very significant mention, because for Proclus, and this also holds true for any other Neoplatonic commentator, so Plato's dialogues reflect a philosophical coherent system, a unitary philosophical doctrine. And for this reason, so the discrepancies or the contradictions that may emerge between different dialogues are only apparent. From this, it follows that Plato's view on the soul, as they are expressed in the Timaeus and in the Phaedrus, cannot be at odds with each other, but must be in mutual agreement. And since in the Phaedrus the soul is said to be ungenerated, it follows that the birth of the soul in the Timaeus should not be understood in temporal terms. So it seems that he's precisely doing what Vlastos was ruling out. So as a result, according to Plutarch, the world soul comes to be at a particular moment of time, while according to Proclus, it is plainly clear that the Timaeus is not speaking of generation in temporal terms. So while Plutarch tries to make sense of the Timaeus in its literal meaning, Proclus goes beyond the literal meaning by stressing the soul's priority of seniority as a priority according to essence. In both cases, even if from different perspectives, the accounts given in the Timaeus and in the Phaedrus turn out to be in agreement. Interestingly, their readings turn out to be different, if not even opposite, although they apply similar exegetical principles when reading Plato. Of course, I'm stressing the continuity between Plutarch and Proclus because I'm contrasting them to some modern interpreters. It is true that they both belong to Platonism and that their approach can be considered to some extent similar, but of course there are also many differences between them. Anyway, despite these differences, since they both take Plato's dialogues as multiple sides of a unitary doctrine, they feel free to draw connections between different passages, and they both use Plato to interpret Plato. Moreover, they share a similar concern, that is to show that Plato does not contradict himself and does not change his mind. And so in conclusion, what lesson can we draw from the views of these two ancient commentators? So even if we do not endorse the assumption that Plato's dialogues are a fully consistent system and the expression of the divinely inspired writer, at least on one point, we can learn much from them. And namely, their approach in dealing with inconsistency in Plato's work seems to be far richer than the modern developmentalist approach, which is in comparison a bit too reductive and too narrow. So there is in modern times also an approach, a way to reconcile the inconsistencies within Plato. So without claiming that he changed his mind. And this consists in laying emphasis on the specific context from which a specific claim is extrapolated. And this is, of course, important because its dialogue, its context has its own argumentative goals, his own concerns and priorities, dramatic frameworks, and so on. And in this light, we may note that both the Phaedrus and the Timaeus are concerned, yes, with the question of beginning, but from different perspectives. So in the former, so in the Phaedrus, the arche is the soul conceived of as a source of motion, and for this reason has to be temporally ungenerated. But the soul is not the arche of everything. It's not the arche of the being of everything which exists. In the Timaeus, on the other hand, we also have an important investigation on the beginning, but on another level, so on a higher level, we may say. And in this framework, the soul cannot be the ultimate arche, so the first arche. And the being of the soul has to be explained by means of something which is above the soul itself, namely the Demiurge and intelligible paradigm. In other words, the soul is not a form, and that's why it's ontologically generated in the Timaeus. So in this way, it is true that the Timaeus and the Phaedrus contain two contradictory claims, but perhaps these claims can turn out to be a bit less contradictory if we don't read them simply as isolated claims, but rather if we evaluate their weight within their respective argumentative frameworks. Okay, I'm done. Thank you very much. I will stop. So.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura, for this this talk. It was not only extremely interesting, but very, very rich. I ask you now, the people attending the seminar, to raise questions, issues, comments, clarification questions, and so on. Yes, Victor.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. All right. So thank you very much for your presentation. It was enlightening, so to say, and I have no objections to your analysis, and nor do I find it, yes, controversial in any respect. But I would like to solely to share some thoughts. I mean, to briefly present the way I see the situation, and then ask about your opinion on it. Perhaps is the same thing that you presented at the solution at the end of your speech, but let us see. So first of all, it is obviously a problem. The Phaedrus and the Timaeus and the laws, and besides that, there's also the laws 10, where soul is actually said to be the arche of everything, including good and bad. So this is a problem. But on the other hand, I believe that the evidence for the soul being generated is overwhelming, and only the Phaedrus stands on the other side. So how to deal with it? Well, I have these ideas that yes. So let's see. First of all, I believe that Plato in the Timaeus and in the laws, when it comes to the soul, proposes, and the world proposes, something that may be called asymmetric sempiternity, which is sempiternity that has a beginning but doesn't have an end, which is like infinite flow of time once it begins. Then, when it comes to the temporality, or the time moments when the soul and the world are generated, one could say, and later argue, perhaps, that the temporality is actually inadmissible. The whole concept of temporality is inadmissible, because this supposed act of creation takes place outside of time, so to say, in a point of eternity, which is kind of a concept very difficult to grasp, but it anyways dismisses the very question of the temporal beginning of the universe, because it takes place outside of time. And so this would be the, let's say, this would be the view of the Timaeus. And then when it comes to the Phaedrus and the generated soul, this is something that Vlastos, of course, already Vlastos proposed, but in a slightly different context. So when Phaedrus is talking about the soul as the origin of motion and as ungenerated and ever-existing thing, he thinks or points out the soul within the already organized universe. So from the Phaedrus, the pre-cosmic phase is excluded, and therefore Plato is free to discuss the soul in the manner as he discusses it in that particular passage. So that would be it. Thank you very much.
So thank you. I think it's plausible, and yeah, I hope maybe I write here again if I forgot to write something. But yeah, I think it's plausible. But so in this way, if I understood you correctly, so you would say that the evidence for the soul to be generated is overwhelming, and that the Phaedrus is the only exception. In this case, then laws would be you would confirm that also in the laws is generated. Yeah. Okay. But it's, and then that it's the source of not of evil, or also of that.
Yeah, that would be all. That would be all related only to the soul within the created universe, and in when it comes to evil, it will be only the propensity of the individual embodied souls. I mean, it's a long discussion, but I can.
Yeah, maybe also another small point, yeah, which is also connected to what I was saying in the end. So I was thinking that a way to reconcile the Phaedrus with the Timaeus was to lay emphasis on this context, of course, then to decide whether this generation took place in time or not is remains somehow an open question. But I was thinking at this formulation in the Phaedrus text, where it said that everything which comes to be needs an arche. And actually, we find the very same formulation also in the Timaeus. But yeah, it's interesting that in the Timaeus, we are not speaking of arche in terms of the souls, which is the beginning of movement. So it's like, yeah, of course, there is somehow a contradiction, but yeah, the accent is a bit different. So in the Timaeus, there is like they are looking for an idea, which is the Demiurge. So there is somehow a small shift of the problem.
Yes, I see it as the difference between the, so to say, the original state, or the original arche, which would be the form and probably the intellect as an additional entity of late Plato, I don't know, and then the universe as an organized whole where the soul takes precedence over everything, starting from the world soul, but then also the individual souls have their saying. So yeah. But it is a fascinating subject indeed. So thank you for raising these issues, and it's puzzling, but yeah, nice.
Okay, thank you. Terry Bristol.
So, Laura, thank you. Very nice talk. I've, as probably others, have struggled with these questions. What is he really saying? What is really going on? So, a couple of just, I don't know. I don't think he ever resolves it in some sense. I mean, it's, you know, and I'm a modern cosmologist too. So, like, what is, what happens before time? Well, it's not a meaningful question. That's the. But where does that take us? Not clear. So one of the expressions that you had was, I know we were talking about that I think it was Proclus talking about the priority of essence, and talking about closer to the Demiurge. So is a Demiurge, where is the Demiurge in relationship to the soul? I mean, that's just a dumb question maybe, but.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big question, and I think that if we raise this question with respect to Plato and with respect to Proclus, is perhaps a bit different, and it's also different to spell out this distinction now in 1 minute. But yeah, I would say that yeah, in Proclus, we should understand. Yeah, there is of course the Demiurge, but yeah, we also have to presuppose this whole so monistic metaphysics behind. So there is, of course, the Demiurge, but it's important to say that there is the one. And in this sense, yeah, cosmology is understood like a proceeding, a derivation of everything. So we have the one, the intellect, and then comes the soul. So
Right. So so let me throw a couple other things at you, which maybe you've come across or not. So to me, Demiurge is translates as a public worker, if you like, but it's but also the other term that's used a lot is architecton, and which I like. I mean, I was just background. I'm very much into philosophy of engineering, so I'm referring to the Timaeus as an early philosophy of engineering. In other words, that this is how the universe comes to be, and it's basically the architecton translated properly is the master engineer. I think in the Stanford encyclopedia it treats it as the architecton as the master craftsman, but for me it's the master engineer. But an important part of that is that the way in which it proceeds, Timaeus says, yes, how did it come to be as it is? And he says, well, I can only give you a probable answer. And one of the aspects of that is that it's not a, what does somebody say? It's not a copyable plan. In other words, however it emerges rather than being a mechanical process, which I like because, engineering is a creative process, emergent process, whereas the strictly scientific thing would see the process as being mechanistic and deterministic, and we have no role in this at all. I mean, I don't know if that is, do you get into any of that with, the architecton, the intelligence of the of the motion and so forth?
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I think there are also some. It could be what you were saying could be well confirmed with if we think how the description of the world and also of the world soul is made, this vocabulary of fabrication. Then I don't know. It's hard to perhaps. I cannot say. I should think a bit more about how to put together this. How do you call it? So this architectonical task. With being a cause, with intelligence and so on. But I think there are both levels going on. Yeah.
Can I sneak in one last, just completely off, but in Aristotle, he talks in the Generation and Corruption essay, he talks about the coming to be as a result of a cyclic process. Excuse me, I got cold. The result of a cyclic process. And I'm not sure I see that in the Timaeus. I mean, in any of these commentaries, where is the cyclic process? Do you see that at all or not?
I don't think it's very much so it's not very much presented in the Timaeus, but of course we find a number of passages in Plato where it's something like that is said. For example, I don't know, I'm thinking of the Phaedrus now very quickly, but there are perhaps also many other passages which may be mentioned in this framework. For example, in order to explain that the soul is immortal, the generation comes always from opposites, and it's always presupposes always a cyclical process. And so usually, many
I suppose that one of the resolutions of the conflict you're looking at is just to say he actually changed his mind, and that there's a sense in which early Plato, or one version of Plato was very Pythagorean and so forth, and then he sort of says, "Oh, wait a minute, there are these incommensurabilities," and oops, all of a sudden, then he gets opposites come into the picture, and in that case, then the whole question is, I mean, he reframes the question from the earlier. Well, I don't know where Timaeus goes in the sequence, but I think that there are these two sides. One which is very Pythagorean, and the other is where you have opposites, and it's if you like Heraclitan.
Yeah, that's possible. But if we manage somehow also to explain it without saying that it changed his mind, I think it would be even better. Yeah.
I like him change. I think it's okay to change your mind, but okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have another question from Cesare Libetta.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Thank you for the speech. It was very insightful and interesting. I was a little bit surprised not to hear about the Cora, not to hear about the receptacle, and that's because we have studied the Timaeus together in the class, and we discussed this idea of the time, the beginning, and the fact that the soul is there, and this kind of contradiction, apparent contradiction. But there is another interpretation in which, especially from Fronterotta, and that comes from Brisson and other, that says that basically in the Timaeus with the Cosmology, with this likely account, Plato is trying to solve the issues that he himself raised with the Parmenides, with the inconsistency, with the idea that there are an ideal world and a sensible world, how they come together. There is something in between. And also the fact that there is this Anaxagorean concept, sorry, that everything was together in not ordered way, and then was made by the Demiurgos, that as was said, Terry said very clearly, is a craftsman at the same time. It's a magistrate. It's something that's order the things. So, and doing this, it's actually is not created the time. Even is that in the Timaeus it's stated clearly that times is created by the Demiurge. But this is in the first account that Timaeus does. Then in the second account, they say, well, we have to go a little bit in deep, and then introduce the Cora concept. And he's saying with this receptacle, and then he start talking about how the things that are immortal, like the soul and everything, comes to be into the things that are changing in the sensible world. So we made peace in the discussion that we had in class about this topic, thinking that maybe time was not really created. And so the fact that the soul is measuring time, as we learned from Aristotle, and then how it's said also by Plato, it's something that in some way should be managed with, let's say, a likely account that is not consistent in itself. So that was my question. So why did you didn't mention the Cora?
Mm-hmm. So you're right. The Cora is of course very important in this discussion, and a reason why I didn't include it is because the passage which I analyzed are problematic, as I was saying in the very beginning, in many respects. So one point I stressed, especially the inconsistencies which emerge if we compare the Timaeus on the other hand with the Phaedrus and with other dialogues. But of course there are also another number of problems which emerge if we read T2, the second passage, along with other passages. And for example, I think what you were saying is really connected also with the question about, so what are we doing with necessity of the Timaeus, or how can we explain the movement before this world soul emerged? So there was some disorderly motion, so how can we explain them if we say that the world soul comes before? But I just focused on the relationship between the Timaeus and the other dialogues, but of course I'm aware that there are also some big issues, even if we remain inside the dialogue. But thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Well, are there other questions?
Yeah, if I may.
Yes.
Have some comments and maybe a question. Thank you, Laura, for the nice presentation. It was very interesting also from the, sorry for my voice because I don't have now much voice. So it was really interesting also from the methodological point of view. So this comparison not only among the Plato's different dialogues, but also with his commentators. And this is my point, because studying the the fortune of or the later commentators of Plato's Timaeus and Plato's work in the 18th century, we deal with different position also towards the Middle and Neoplatonists. So at some point we have a kind of shift from the reference to Neoplatonist commentators as the main reference point to the Middle Platonists. So Plutarch, in this sense, represents also for authors like Schelling a new source, let's say, that one can or one must reconsider in order to reduce the influence of the Neoplatonic interpretation of Plato's work. So it was interesting to compare the two different positions from Plutarch and Proclus. I don't have a specific, no, I was wondering if you can say something more regarding the Plutarch interpretation and regarding the passage, if it comments something on the passage from the irrational soul to the rational world soul. If it said something, I don't know, precise, more precise, if you know something. Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for your remark. I didn't know that, for example, in Schelling's reconstruction, Neoplatonism was more influenced than the Middle Platonic view. I would say that to some extent this is true also today, even if Plutarch's reading is now being rehabilitated in the last decades. But yeah, perhaps the Neoplatonic view is still a big priority. And about Proclus, so as I was saying, it distinguishes these two souls or these two stages. And so in the first stage, it is also interesting that this soul in itself, which is ungenerated, is related to him, also to the necessity of the Timaeus or to the illimited in the Phaedrus. And then at some point when the Demiurge enters into action, so in a precise point of time, so the Demiurge operates with these ratios, with these numbers, and makes the soul harmonious. And this is the passage actually. And from that moment on, this soul in itself becomes harmonious, rational. He says it partakes of the forms, and from that point on, we have the world soul. That's the passage. So actually, it speaks of generation in time, but it's also conceived of as ordering a pre-existing material which was somehow chaotic, and always with this dualism between disorder and reason. And that's why it's very different from the Neoplatonic point of view, where we have the derivation from the one.
Thank you. And maybe something regarding the passage that you quoted from the laws, when you say something about matter, if you have here a distinction between the concept of originary matter and the material things, matter as concrete objects. So do you have here in the
passage 3 or 4, or in both of them?
Oh, sorry, I don't have it in.
Okay.
I think
it speaks simply of soma.
Soma. So bodies. So it's just the created thing, and you don't have the concept of.
Kora.
Koras. No. in this passage, in this reference, we don't are dealing with. Okay. yeah, just that. Thank you.
Are there other questions, comments? No? Well, I have just a very short remark because I think that it's very intriguing, this idea that we can find in Plato's dialogues the suggestion, so to speak, no, of well, not only the suggestion. I would like to say the hypothesis that for us it's possible to think of a generation or something being generated, but not in temporal terms. So now the interesting thing is that if we think of time, I mean, time in the Timaeus, for example, is not there until the world is there. So the temporality appears to be generated in a sense. Now the process of generation of time is not in time. It's clear, because otherwise it will be a paradox, it will be a contradiction, etc., or nonsense. Now, could you add, please, Laura, if you like, of course, if you wish, a few words on what you think that this atemporal generation implies, especially for, you know, well, for current philosophy in a sense, because we are posing in certain fields of philosophy of physics, but also in theoretical physics, models of quantum gravity, for example, some of them, the problem of the so-called emergence of space and time, of space-time. But still, there are people, I mean, scientists, like Rovelli, for example, who suggested that time at the most fundamental level is not there. So do you think that it's worth investigating? I mean, what is the import of thinking of a generation that is not temporal? So how can we spell it out in ontological terms? Because of course, it's complicated. Do you think that logics can help in it, or mathematics, or I don't know, some new ontology? Yeah, what's your idea about it?
Yeah, that's a super big question, but I think it's, yeah, I think I'm sympathetic with the idea that both the world soul and also time can be said to be generated, even if we don't speak in trivial or temporal terms. And I think what you were saying about the time is true also for the world soul. So in the beginning, I was just putting on the same level, so cosmos, time, and world soul. But of course, you have to say that time as a temporal beginning is perhaps it's perhaps a bit different, at least in Platonic terms, because in that case we are dealing with something which is visible, sensible, which is pretty low ontological status. But then when we talk of time or of the soul, I think in that case it's a bit harder to. So I think it's a good path, the one you are indicating. Then which tools we should use in order to spell this out? Yeah, that's hard. yeah, perhaps mathematics can help, ontology, of course, and yeah, perhaps also, yeah, to take some inspiration from these ancient views. Now, when you were talking, I was again thinking at Proclus. So he says, yeah, there are so some entities which are both so generated and imperishable. And for example, the cosmos is like that. There are then entities which are imperishable and also ungenerated, but there are also so entities which are somehow generated, so ontologically generated, but imperishable. And the soul is precisely there, and also time. So we are in. So from the ontological point of view, we might say we are in a metaxy level, so in between. And yeah, but yeah, it's hard to answer. But I think it's nice to think it without a temporal beginning.
Yeah, and also because we have a, let's say, an intrinsic difficulty in talking about generation, not in temporal terms. I mean, we as human beings, but we have examples of, think of solutions of equations. We have examples of entities that are generated out of time. I mean, one can say that the solution of a certain equation is already there. It's contained already in the, anyway. Sometimes it's not, I mean, for us, it's not in the sense that we have to calculate the result. And sometimes it takes a while. And thanks to computers today, we can solve certain equations that were not solvable in the past. But it's intriguing, the fact that Plato thought about this atemporal dimension of generation. But of course, he also talked about the generation of the three-dimensional world, of the sensible world. But anyway, it's a long story. I don't want to bother people yes, too much today. So Terry Bristol, do you have another question for?
No, I was just going to kind of comment, as long as we're getting broadly philosophical here. So I'm American, as coming from American pragmatism, which I quite like, and one of the mantras or the things we say is like, so what? Okay, so the question is what is a meaningful question? Okay, now obviously we encounter this a little bit when people say, well, you know, what happened before time? Well, you know, this is Hawking and the cosmology. Well, that's not a meaningful question. It's like saying what's north of the North Pole. Nothing is not a meaningful question. So what I want to ask is what does it matter? What is it we're actually trying to answer here? Okay, are we trying to give a description of the universe? Is that what we're after? Because I think as it evolves in Plato, the issue, the ultimate questions, the final question, and this is, I go back to the Socratic, you know, as he's dying and all this sort of stuff. So what are the real questions? What are meaningful questions? And really what he gets down to is it's the meaningful question is how should we live? And so I'm wondering, like, so where does the question of the beginning and of time and so forth come into this? I mean, are we just tilting at windmills? I mean, are we quixotic here? What was Plato going after? I mean, there's a Parmenides Heraclitus thing, which I spent a lot of time on, fortunately or not. But I don't see. I mean, in the end, Plato, you know, in Socrates' terms, he just said, well, there's Parmenides and Heraclitus. There's one group says everything's change, and everything's constancy, and he said, I can't make sense of these guys, which I think is the modern situation as well. And then he makes the turn, the Socratic turn. He says, well, the real questions, the questions that I was always asking, and that make sense, are questions about how we should live. So what I'm posing here is I'm not getting hold of why it matters how we answer this as to how we should live. Now, I like the idea that we have eternal souls and all that sort of stuff. That's good. And I think that the universe as a whole is good. But I don't know, does that stimulate anybody to comment?
Well, I don't know whether Laura.
Laura, go ahead.
I can say something. I
Me
don't know.
too. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead, sorry.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
If you want to start.
No, I was thinking that actually I fully agree with but the meaning of question is Cassirer actually was the one that was pointing out that Neoplatonism actually was trying to not only to solve this problem about the universal and about the two different worlds, but also giving the sense of the reality of the life, of the meaningful life, what is good. To have an immortal soul, it's something. To have someone that has generated an immortal soul is something else. But to see that the world is something because we are seeing it and we are living in it, it gives a complete different perspective, in my idea, in my opinion. So that's for me, it's important to see that time, soul, everything was part of a whole, like humanity, and then we are part of this, even if we are perishable creature, of course, and that makes sense. So that's the question, the point that I was trying to make. Sorry, it's a little bit vague, but
I might add that in just to set context a little bit, that Sylvia was saying about the mathematics is going to help us. I doubt it. The modern, I'm very big on thermodynamics, which is a mess. But this whole idea that the entropic universe, the heat death, and all that sort of stuff coming out of modern physics, it's what's the proper word to use here? It's not credible. Okay, it's messed up. It's contradictory. It's all screwed up. But it comes out of a mechanical view of the universe. And it has, anyway, the whole idea that the universe is running down. I mean, the evidence is all in the opposite direction, but they're locked into this ideology of the universe running down. And the Timaeus, which I quite like, and that is this idea of the architecton, this idea of a constructive model of the universe. The universe is actually not only created, but being created. It's continually being created. And it's a very different view. And I think there's a lot of people who are very sympathetic to that, but they don't know what to do with the entropic. I call them the entropic cult. They're just ideological crazies, and they just can't get their head out of the idea that the universe is going down. But they're, in particular, if you're looking at something really nice, there's a book called, I think it's The Origin and Nature of Life, by Harold Morowitz and somebody else, quite nice. And I've worked with a bunch of people about the deep sea vents. And these are all people who see the universe, the modern scientific view, which they don't like the mechanical version of the modern scientific view. They see it as a constructive process. And they very much dislike Darwin. And they see it as a constructive process. It seems to me to be in keeping with the Timaeus. I've made some presentations on this and stuff. But the idea that the universe is actually systematically developing, and we're part of it. And I like John Dewey's expression, we're participants in the creation of the good. So the actual construction, one of the things that Timaeus says, he says, well, it's probable and all this, and questions, but he says, one thing's for certain, it always moves to the good.
Yeah.
And it's crucial, okay? And this is an essential part of engineering philosophy too, and that is that the engineer is always trying to move from a current state of affairs to a more desirable future state of affairs, which is always trying to make the universe good. And I think that's what the architect is trying to do.
I would like to ask Laura to reply.
Please.
If she wishes to your question.
Yeah, I only had a very, very small remark that is perhaps not my opinion, but perhaps what Plato would answer. which is that, I don't know, perhaps the question, how should we live today, is not so far away from the question, how did the world or how did time came into being? Yeah, because as we have seen, so cosmology and psychology are so closed, and yeah, psychology is also close with ethics. So I think, yeah, without putting and mixing everything together, I think there are much more interconnections in his thought than the ones we maybe perceive today. And so after all, also, yeah, those were, so the question of the beginning of time and the world were also the questions that a philosopher after 50 years of formation would have focused on, and he was the one who was living well. And so I don't see like boundary in between these two questions. So only that.
Certainly the question that is in this is the nature of time is central to all this, modern and Platonic.
Well, thank you very much. I think that if there are no other comments, questions, we can thank our speaker again. Thank you very much, Laura, for the beautiful talk, and thank you everyone for the stimulating discussion. We will have our next meeting next week with a paper by Philip Karfik. So thank you all, and have a nice evening and weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Laura. Bye.